Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our mental health moment, a conversation about mental health stigma with Dr. Patrick Corrigan, understanding and reducing mental health stigma in children, youth, and families. This mental health moment is part of a series that we often do, talking to experts in the field to share their thoughts and insights on areas related to mental health, generally speaking, and in particular in child and adolescent and family services. So I want to also point you all to resources that we've been developing over the last year or so. We have a special initiatives page on our CTAC NY website, our CTAC New York website, and we want to direct you to that special initiatives page to look at some other materials that we have been developing, materials for organizations to think about ways in which they can combat stigma, also at the individual practitioner level. So there's a bunch of resources that are available. I also mention that because as we talk to Dr. Corrigan about mental health stigma, we're going to focus on issues around children, youth, and families, but the resources on the special initiatives page really gives you a lot of additional information about the topic of stigma and what organizations and individual practitioners can do to combat it. I want to take a moment to also, of course, introduce our speaker today. Dr. Patrick Corrigan is an internationally recognized expert and researcher in the field of mental health stigma. He's a distinguished professor of psychology and director of the Health Equity Education and Research and a core faculty member in the Division of Counseling and Rehabilitation Science at the Illinois Institute of Technology. He has spent the past 2 decades broadening his research to the prejudice and discrimination of mental illness. His work has been supported by the National Consortium on Stigma and Empowerment. He's also extended his research to mental health and the social determinants of mental health, understanding the impact or the intersecting impact of mental health, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, and age, and how that relates to social disadvantage related to poverty, criminal justice involvement, immigration concerns, and that has led to the development of the Chicago Health Disparity Center. Dr. Corrigan, his group has also launched the Illinois Institute of Technology training program, yielding the Recovery Support Specialist certificate for Illinois tech students. So he does a lot of work training and supporting peer support providers. He's also written more than 500 peer-reviewed articles. Is editor emeritus of the American Journal of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and editor of Stigma and Health, published by the APA. He's also authored or edited 20 books, including most recently The Stigma Effect through Columbia University Press. And lastly, he's also part of a team that developed the Honest, Open, and Proud series of anti-stigma programs, focusing on supporting folks with mental health challenges to tell their stories and share their experiences with mental health and mental illness. And he's the 2022 recipient of the American Psychological Association Award for Distinguished Contribution to Psychology in the Public Interest. So I want to welcome Dr. Patrick Corrigan. And Pat, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your wisdom and insights with our audience. And I just want to start very simply with a question just so folks can get to know you. What brought you to this work? Why did you get into this work around mental health stigma?
So I come to it wearing several hats. And by the way, to set ground rules, please call me Pat. The only people who call me Patrick are my parents. And the only people who call me doctor are my children. And that was an effort to get some control over them. I come at this wearing 3 hats. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. So I've been developing and operating programs for people with serious mental illness and recovery for the last 30 years. I also am a researcher, privileged to do a lot of research in this space. And in the process, about 20 years ago, I realized that even though we can help people in recovery by providing skills and supports and in the community wisdom, they still often have a hard time meeting their goals because employers won't hire them, or landlords won't rent to them, or primary care doctors withhold a certain standard of care. So we became very interested in the stigma of mental illness and, more importantly, how to fix it. In the process, I had to admit, hey, I'm a person with serious mental illness. I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, major depression, anxiety disorder. I know what it means to be locked up on a locked unit for a week because I was out of control and having to call my wife and tell her I can't make it to my daughter Elizabeth's school function. Took my meds this morning, regularly see a psychiatrist. And so the stigma of mental illness is not an abstraction for me. It's something very near and dear to me.
Um, Thank you for sharing that, Pat. And, one of the things that is clear in your work is that you see this issue of mental health stigma as an issue of social justice. And and it's interesting because a lot of times when you talk about issues of social justice for a variety of historically marginalized or targeted groups, oftentimes the idea, sort of the question comes up around, haven't we made enough progress? So in a lot of areas with regards to race relations and gender, sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think similarly with mental health, right? We see celebrities, performers, um, athletes coming out and talking about their struggles with mental illness. So like, I think the conversation has risen. So I guess I know this might sound a little kind of uh, rhetorical, but why is it important that we talk about mental health stigma, given all the progress we see being made out there?
So I think the stigma of mental illness is in the same category as racism, sexism, and homophobia. And those are problematic at so different levels, and we can talk about how it applies to mental illness. But on one level, when it comes to ethnicity, it's robbed people of their rightful opportunities and diminished their ability to pursue the goals they want. So we might think it's gotten better. In trying to understand mental illness stigma, while I am steeped in models of racism and sexism, I pretty much can tell in a group of 100 people who is of a different ethnic group as I am by skin color and who's a different gender than I am by body type. And if I'm racist or sexist, I can discriminate against them. You can't do that with mental illness. It's fundamentally hidden. As a matter of fact, if there is a life experience that falls in the category that makes sense to me, it's LGBTQ. Let me do a footnote in case there's any doubt. I am not saying gay is a mental illness. It's probably one of the more heinous things that DSM ever did. But what's similar between the two is they're hidden, as you can't see it unless you come out. And while we made long strides in my lifetime about LGBTQ, including marriage, I hope people agree with me. We haven't fixed that by a long shot. For that matter, racism by a long shot hasn't gone away. And so while there is some improvement in the stigma of mental illness, and we can talk about that, and I think recovery is one idea is perhaps the best embodiment of that, I still think we have a long way to go.
Yeah, and I want to say that much of the research that you've done and much of the research out there focuses a lot, of course, on adults with serious mental illness, and that's oftentimes where it is. A lot less is talked about, or there's emerging literature and emerging research on the impact of mental health stigma on young people, youth, parents, and caregivers, and children. And I want to know if you could share your thoughts about that, and what we know. And in addition to that, if you can, how the various forms of stigma, there are so much. Again, I want to direct folks to our special initiatives page because Pat's not going to go into a deep dive on all of the forms of stigma. But if you could share with folks a couple of those couple forms of stigma that are most relevant for this conversation, especially around children, youth, families, parents, and caregivers.
So let me answer the second question first. Like any pedantic academic, I probably broken it down to 83 different types, and doesn't do anybody justice to sit down and get to that level. I think at the broad level, there's two types of stigma, whether we're talking about mental health challenges or LGBTQ or ethnicity. And the first one is the public stigma, the harm that people experience when the general public believes in the stereotypes, all people with mental illness are dangerous, and act on it. Therefore, I want to hire them if I were an employer. Compare that to the self stigmas. What happens when you live in a world that stigmatizes your condition? You internalize it and beat yourself up. So I started in the area looking mostly at adults. My particular area of success is looking at adults with psychiatric disability, which for me would be not just a DSM diagnosis, but anybody who's not able to attain their major life goals like school or career or significant other because of a mental illness. As a clinical psychologist, I took loads of classes in child psych, but I'm humble enough to know I really don't know much about understanding the demands of children and mental health, or for that matter, what the family experience. That said, where does the stigma of mental illness in children fall? I've written a couple papers sort of opining how the development of children from infancy to young adults, adolescent to me being a key moment, also launching. I think there's ideas of understanding self-stigma. But here's the reality is I've tried to study it, and IRBs, institutional review boards, are huge barriers because unlike studying anybody who's 18, which I can launch a Qualtrics survey and do it, anybody under 18, rightfully so, need to have parental approval. And that one place you do is in schools, and schools just don't want you around asking those kind of questions. As editor of Stigma and Health, I know there's just not a lot of research on the stigma experienced by children across the developmental stages, or for that matter, family. There are some programs that have been done I'd be glad to talk to, as well as do some brainstorming and what we might want to do for this group. But there's some structural hurdles that keep us from doing this research.
And you know what I want to go into. So I think certainly the direct impact of stigma as being someone who carries that identity status and lives with it. But I want to know if you could say a couple of words about associative stigma as well. So oftentimes working with parents and caregivers in particular, that associative stigma, right? Not necessarily having stigma, but having, in this particular case, or in the child of family, having a child, a young adult, or an adolescent with mental health challenges. Can you say a little bit about associative stigma and in
So
particular that impact on parents and caregivers?
that's a term that Irving Goffman, who's a Sigmund Freud of stigma, came up with. He argued that stigma not only comes from having the condition itself, but being associated with. So there's a different kind of stigma being associated with a person with mental illness. And what we most commonly think about is parents of their children. That leads to a certain sense of shame themselves and their feeling of being in the closet, not being able to share the experience. But I would like to add to that a different kind of stigma family members experience, which we would call vicarious stigma. So there's a shame and associated stigma. I'm ashamed of having a child with autism. And let's be clear, when I use any of these examples, I'm using them as examples of the wrong thing to say. I obviously don't think you should be ashamed of a child with autism. Vicarious stigma is all the hard feelings, the sadness or anger you experience when you see your child being excluded. So they're having a party at school and your child's not being invited. It either makes you angry, damn them, what's going on, or it makes you sad, sort of tearful, you're rightfully so, your little one's being left out.
And thank you for that level setting and that grounding on two forms of stigma that can directly impact parents. Um, and I want to sort of, as we move into intervention, I want to talk a little bit about, how complicated it can be. And I also say that too because sometimes, right, there are different outcomes developed depending on stakeholders. So, for example, from the provider community, stigma is important because it gets in the way of folks receiving services and wanting to come in for services. So like providers, state offices of mental health and other groups want to see increased utilization of services, but those folks carrying the conditions and carrying the mental health stigma may have different outcomes as well. They want to get help, but they also have different outcomes. Can you say a little bit about that? What are some approaches to combating stigma, and then how you think about the different stakeholders who are involved in their stake in reducing stigma?
So, um, let's unpack that. Loosely put, I would say efforts to decrease the public stigma of mental illness, the attitudes the population has about people with mental illness and their families. That's pretty much broken down to education or contact. Education is trying to counter the myths of mental illness versus the facts. The myths of mental illnesses are all dangerous. The fact is that they probably don't have a higher rate of danger than the rest of the population, clearly more likely to be victim. That's education. Contact is actually meeting someone with mental illness as a peer, fully disclosing. And so the one take-home message I would share with your group is our research and meta-analysis pretty clearly says contact's where it's at. Education doesn't really have a lot of effect, especially on adults, because I don't care what you tell me about genetics and this being a brain disorder. They're bad. I see it on the news all the time. They scare the hell out of me. Meeting somebody with mental illness, you see that they are as diverse and complicated as anybody else, and that can have a big change. That said, why might we as a group go into an anti-stigma program? You sort of alluded to one. There's this idea called label avoidance, that the best way to get the stigma of mental illness is to be seen with a label of mental illness. An easy way to get that is to be seen coming out of a psychiatrist's office, or somebody to see you have some kind of pills which are antidepressants. And so people try to avoid the label. They won't go into care. And so the first purpose of trying to decrease stigma is to try to diminish the negative feelings about it so people will seek out care when they can. That doesn't always serve the need of the advocate with mental illness themselves, because the second one is what we would call more the civil rights agenda, which is the goal of the civil rights movement, in my opinion, amongst many, was to decrease discrimination so people can have their right to jobs and careers and living and the like. And so the second goal of public stigma is to decrease the public bias so people with mental illness can pursue work and careers and education and children and have 2.3 children and live in the suburbs like everybody else. The third goal is the self-stigma, is the self-worth. I always say it's hard enough being a person with mental illness and dealing with anxiety and depression, but on top of that, you're supposed to feel ashamed of yourself. And so the third thing is trying to replace shame with a sense of pride, empowerment, and recovery. And so those are the three different reasons why you might tackle stigma.
Well, and that's a great lead in, Pat, to talking a little bit about your intervention, the intervention that you and your group developed. HOP, honest, open, and proud, sounds to me like from what you're describing is an attempt at addressing a few of those things. Contact, it can facilitate contact. It can facilitate reducing self-stigma by giving folks space to tell their stories and think about how and when it's appropriate to tell their stories. So, and it increases contact, right? The ability of folks to share with others. And let's talk a little bit about honest, open, and proud. If you want to share a little bit about the history of it and its purpose and
You
goals.
betcha. It's been around about 15 years. It was developed by other people with lived experience, mostly in Canada, Australia, and the US. So it has kind of an English bias to it. And I hope we can talk about what it means to adapt it to other conditions and groups and ethnic groups, because that's quite a process. But it's based on the assumption, again, learned from the LGBTQ community, that perhaps one of the most powerful ways to decrease public stigma is to disclose that person you're sitting next to with work takes meds for schizophrenia, that the extended person in your family has bipolar disorder, that your minister has major depression. That kind of disclosure is probably the secret to diminishing the stigma of LGBTQ. My kids avoided all that horror about homophobia because by the time they got to school, It's not that they learned it was genetic and biological. It's because they had a gay minister and they have a gay uncle. They have two gay uncles. And they learned by inner experience that this is part of the human condition. And so we would argue that this disclosure of mental illness is good because the more of us that are out, the more it's going to tear down the stigma. Separate from that, what we've learned in interviews with gay people, what we've learned in a lot of research in people with mental illness is being in the closet is a horrible place to be. It's horrible for your health. It fills with secrets, and secrets are a very egregious way to live your life. So Honest, Open, Proud came out to help people make decisions about disclosing. Notice that even though I think disclosure is a good idea and I have disclosed, there are a lot of risks to it. And I encourage people to think of those risks and act accordingly. HOP is a 3-step, purposely brief program, originally pre-COVID done face-to-face. Now there are virtual versions of it, led by 2 people with lived experience. We can talk about what that means in terms of children and families. For us, that means if I'm working with serious mental illness, the facilitators are likely to be people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, done with 6 to 8 peers who are trying to decide. And there's 3 steps to it. The first step is what are the pros and cons of coming out? What are your individual pros and cons of coming out, which, by the way, will change for you depending on what's going on in your life, and also will vary depending on whether we're talking about coming out at work versus church versus faith-based community versus extended family. The second step is if you're going to come out, there are strategic ways to try to do it. So I've just met Jim. He seems to be a sport. I might come out to him. One of the ways to check him out is to take him to Starbucks and say, hey, you seen Silver Linings Playbook? He's not that old. He doesn't know that movie. So I briefly go through it with him with Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence. Mr. Cooper has a bipolar disorder and doing all sorts of things with symptoms, but despite that, he's presented with dignity. And if Jim responds, I'm sick and tired of Hollywood coming off of that politically correct BS about mental illness, he's probably not a good guy to come out to. If, on the other hand, he's sort of good, then we can sort of bring it back to our world. Okay, do you know anybody who has a serious mental illness? Jim and I work together. You know anybody at work? What do you think of this as a good idea? I can test people before I actually do it. And the third thing is your story. What's it going to be? You do this in a group with other people. If for some reason you believe you're particularly inspired by God, it's not up to me to tell you whether to say that or not. It's up to get feedback, and you decide how you want to include it in your story, and your story is a dynamic thing. There's 3 groups to it, and then there's a follow-up 1 month later. How'd it go? Did you do it? Well, actually not anecdotally. Research-wise, we'll find about 1/3 of people actually do disclose. However, it has a robust effect on your sense of self-esteem and depression because you're sort of sitting there saying, wow, I never knew I had this power before. And so that to us is the benefit of Honest, Open, Proud, which I see our colleagues put the website in the chat box.
Yeah. And we want to spend some time at Q&A for folks to ask questions and talk a little bit more about HOP. So we'll make sure we have time for that. And actually, just a little heads up, for those of you who are interested in Honest, Open, and Proud, we're going to have at the end of today's session an opportunity to get your feedback and your thoughts about your interest in starting or doing an Honest, Open, and Proud group with your community. So I just want to give you all that heads up. But we're going to continue with our talk with Pat, and then at the end we'll have that survey to gauge interest in Honest, Open, and Proud. You touched a little bit, Pat, on the outcomes, a couple of them, with regards to disclosure, self-esteem, and depression. You know, as a researcher, and for me, small R researcher, but I am curious, do we know of any iatrogenic effects, negative effects that can happen as a result of Honest, Open, and Proud? And please, more about what you're seeing are obviously, of course, be either positive effects or the effects that help people move forward.
So right on you, is there negative effects? That's at the essence of what we're doing at HOP. While personally, as a lived experience, I think there's some benefits to it. Personally, I also tell you there's some limitations to it. And it's up to the individual to make decisions for themselves, which again might be a dynamic process. You might make a decision as you go. That said, we love to quote a Supreme Court justice who said it's hard to stop the clanging bell. So while I'm very much a liberal and think everybody should be out, I know there's tremendous risks. And once you're out, it's hard to go back. And so you need to include that. One of the secrets, in our opinion, of going out is it sort of gravitates to a like-minded community, other people with serious mental illness, what we're now calling peer communities, can be a place to gravitate to with like-minded people of pride and recovery instead of shame.
Mm. That makes me wonder too. So certainly peer support, and creating spaces where folks have exposure to affinity groups like others. I wasn't planning on saying this, Pat, but now that you bring it up, I'm curious about the role of allies in all this. So when we think about social justice issues, right, we think about those who are sort of members of the targeted group or the marginalized group, but the importance of allies. And I'm just curious about that because it seems like they play an important role in creating those spaces as well that are accepting and affirming.
Yeah. Um, Thank you for adding allies. Just another personal bit of disclosure. I'm a straight male. I have huge interest in LGBTQ, but I would argue at best I'm an ally. That efforts to change negative views and replace them with pride should be led by people LGBTQ, because when you don't, you're sort of insinuating there's some sort of weakness in it that they can't do it for themselves. I think that's an even much bigger problem in mental illness, because people with serious mental illness have this whole thing of whether they're capable of making decisions for themselves. And you have a provider class of people, doctors, who go around talking for people with mental illness. Um, and so in that case, in my opinion, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, professional counselors are allies. It doesn't mean they're diminished, but it means, and they never speak for people with mental illness, but they try to echo the power of that. The more complicated issue, which I know you want to get into, is where do families fall? And partly that because of a more complicated issue when you talk about how old the person is with mental health challenges. Let me start with the one I know best, which is adults. Generally, we fall under the view the stigma of mental illness and the challenges they have are the individuals with mental illness. That said, we never diminish the needs or goals. Let's make this simple and say parents of adult children. That they too suffer stigma, but they suffer different stigma. They suffer this associative stigma, this vicarious stigma. And so part of what they need to sort out as adults is how to deal with their stigma versus how to be supportive of their loved one. Everything's up for grabs with kids. Part of that's a legal issue because parents have legal responsibility, but more so it's the social and cognitive development aspect of it and the degree to which mom and dad impact that. There's some evidence that stigma of parents about mental illness will filter down to their kids. In addition, obviously, parents are the champions of recovery and empowerment in their kid. And so the stigma of children is more complex, which is why I go back to my cop out earlier, is I'm not really strong on kids. I'm strong on stigma. I'd be delighted to engage in you all in discussion about that. And there is some child versions of HOP, but that's sort of where we're at in terms of that issue.
Well, and let's circle back. We'll come back to parents and caregivers in a moment, but let's start with youth. How about young people? Because I know one of the versions of HOP that has been developed is one specifically for, I believe, in for adolescents, and in particular in school settings. Of course, obviously there are a lot of different settings, but if you could say a little bit about the adaptations of HOP for young people.
So one thing I'm excited about is Hop moved from us to a much bigger community. There's actually a steering committee of people interested in Hop, which if anybody, I think we share with you the website and go there to become more active about it. About 10 years ago, my college students came to me and said, this adult thing don't work for us. One of the interesting things that came out is generally there's a thought that a lot of serious mental illness in adults kick in when they go off to college. And so one of the things they have disclosure issues. How do you go home and tell mom and dad? Another issue they have, which I'm totally Greek on, is Instagram, Twitter, X, whatever. We would never, in the spirit of how presume you not disclose on those various platforms. We would suggest with peers, you might want to decide. We'd also suggest, and I sincerely don't know, on the degree to which you disclose on Instagram, is that a permanent tattoo out there for you or not? And what does it mean? That was developed, and all of these are on the website. That's a college version that pretty much is different. The high school version was really interesting and really one of those aha moments because we developed a high school version. Remember, these things, by the nature of Hop, are run by people with lived experience. So the college version done by college version. And so the high school version, we said, well, great, high school students can do this in high school. And somebody said, what about mandated reporting? I mean, in college, if somebody says somebody's on whaling on them, that's horrible, but we're not mandated to do anything about it. In high school, if mom and dad are wailing on them, we become mandated reporters. So the version for high school is done with some sort of quote unquote provider, maybe a school social worker and a kid with lived experience. The other big thing is the high school version, which was developed by high school, is much more interactive, maybe for lack of a better word, fun. And so it has the same goals. Yeah. The other interesting thing, again, when you talk about research, and I have that word tattooed on my arm, the research issue has been harder for us to study on Hop for kids because once again, it's harder to engage. Bless you, for those of you who do research on kids, it's harder to engage kids in research purely from the ethics viewpoint.
Yeah. And I could see that, and of course, yes, as the, kind of the targets of the stigma, much more difficult also for them to be able to, younger children, of course, express the understanding of those issues. Although, we do know that children, even as young as preschool, are already understanding that, going back to some of the issues that we raised earlier around social justice, understanding how people get treated differently based on race and gender, class, and other issues. So we do know
I
from
can tell you one compelling study we did that we tried to replicate it with mental illness that didn't work is there's a Canadian psychologist named Abood who's done this research handing young children, 1 and 2 year olds, black and white dowels and black dowels. And there's a thought that they, especially the white kids, act negatively to the black dowels, that there's some thought that we're born with a sense of difference and difference is bad. And that's one of the bit of research done on young people, which really blows my mind. We tried it in mental illness. The problem with mental illness is, again, understanding mental illness is really stuck with language. I mean, you somehow got to say, and so we were not able to prove it, but there is some compelling research about how ingrained it is. Let's be clear. I'm not saying it's ingrained, therefore we should put up with it. It does suggest to us that is something that's there that mom and dad need to be mindful of.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of the research out there in terms of intervening around equity, issues of equity, and training folks is to help them become aware of their biases, which is oftentimes difficult. And then, of course, putting the accountability and the responsibility, sort of once you are aware of your biases, then doing something about it. But let's not go there. I want to circle back to the question of parents and caregivers. And I know you mentioned a little bit about adaptations that have been made. If you can say a little bit about the adaptations that have been made for parents and caregivers in particular, that addresses some of the issues specific to parents and caregivers around associative and vicarious stigma, if you can. I know, again, it's not your area of focus, but
Well, I pretend. Um, so we're very fortunate to have a child psychologist in Australia named Jennifer Ohan, who works with children, young children, 1 to 4, with developmental disabilities and their parents. And what their parents always said, I got to keep this a secret. I can't tell anybody. It's kind of struggling with it. I can't even tell anybody about my successes. And so she developed HOP for parents of young children in the sort of quote unquote developmental space. To which, talking before this, Jim said, what about mental health? I said, that's an excellent point. I don't know. Which illustrates my point to you is we don't develop anything outside of a community-based participatory research network. And we would argue that parents of young children with developmental challenges is a community. And we would argue you can only develop that with them as our research partners in adapting. It's had some really interesting implications for adapting things to other cultures, by the way.
yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about that. I know there might be a lot involved. By the way, I just want to point out that our amazing coordinator, Connor, is putting in the chat links to resources that Pat is referring to, the adaptation of HOP for adolescents, the adaptation of HOP for parents and caregivers. So maybe quickly, if you can give us the brief version, Pat, if someone was out there, I'll use myself. If I was interested in starting a hop group, what are some and adapting it because one of the things that I think you've been clear about is actually it should be adapted. If I'm not mistaken, Pat, I think you've talked a little bit about how hop is adaptable and in many ways should be adapted for your particular community. What are some things some steps that I can take to adapting hop for a specific community?
Um, so let me answer that in reverse. What should you, if you want to do it? You can, I own the copyright to HOP. You can go online, download it, use it for free. You can take it all into materials and are like. It's a little nuanced. We do offer virtual training. That is the one thing we charge people because they have to find some trainer to sort of do it, and we can talk about the specifics. Adapting it. On one hand, again, I start from the viewpoint of humility. Let me talk to you about one group that was a gas to adapt with, which was Chinese. Chinese and mainland China. I'm not Chinese. I need to be very humble about that. We put together a CBPR team of Chinese. It had to be led by a Chinese American because, of course, they're working in Chinese. One of the big things they came up with, which is just totally blows me away, is here we're really into self-determination. If I'm a young adult and I want to go to school, it's up to me to decide. There, it's really into where's mom and dad in the whole process. Not in a statement of authority that we're in control, but in a statement of they just get very intimately involved in things. So if you want to adapt it, amen, brother. I'm with you in adapting it. My brief challenge is because adapting is very labor intensive. Is there anything that already exists? I'm not trying to derail you and get you not to do it. The other thing is this whole thing about intersectionality. For those of you who don't know it, intersectionality came out of race and gender studies, that we know racism, let's reduce the black and white, is a huge issue. And we know sexism, male and female, is a huge issue. Putting them together is much more than just adding it up. Intersection is trying to understand the different ways of approaching stigma in Black women versus everybody else. We don't presume it's more, we presume it's different. So every time you add an intersection to HOP, you're narrowing the group it applies to. That's fine. It's just whether you have the efforts. And by the way, if I want to put out a plug, we've been dying to do HOP for substance use disorder. And actually written grants, they had a hard time doing it. We just got a grant to do it for people who are just as involved. They just have different stories to tell, so they probably want to be involved in developing it. The fun thing about CBPR, and we do a lot of it, I know it's going great when they come up with an idea that I hate, because that's just the point, right? Is, I'm not, we did a study on Black homeless people and I live in the suburbs. What do I know about that? We have to hire as partners, not as research participants, partners, people from that community.
And I will normally we'll save Q&A for the end, but there is one really quick CBPR. I know you've mentioned it. There's a question around CBPR, community-based participatory research. I'll say, but if you want to say a little bit more about that.
So CBPR is sort of the adaptation of the way research has generally been done. So when I got out of graduate school, I was a genius. I knew everything. I would sit behind my desk, talk to a couple of other psychologists. We would figure out what the hypotheses are. And we develop an intervention for a community. On the mental health side, it's also called participatory action research. Sorry for all the labels. CBPR is if you're going to do research in mental health for recovery that's actually going to work, you need to have people with mental health lead the research. I mean, they're research participants. It means we all sit around the table. When we did this peer program for homeless people, it took us a year to develop it. This is, again, is sort of what I come back to. I'm not homeless. I don't live this sort of thing. And they'll say, doc, that just won't work. What we're doing at the table, somebody like me is doing at the table, is we do have the know-how to do science in case you want to collect data at this. But what people with lived experience have the ownership of it. And so that's a parent coming in and going out. Coming in, the ownership of it is, hey, they've been there. They got all sorts of insights. And going out, the reality is researchers like Jim and I, when we're done, we put it in a journal article and put it on the shelf. These people are the people who are going to own it and take it and actually try to do something with it.
Well, Pat, I guess I want to ask you, and you've kind of been touching on this, but in terms of what we need, because you've talked about sort of some gaps, where do you see the future of this work going? You've kind of already thrown out a few things of things you would love to see, and I think, but I'm curious, what does the future of this work around HOP look like for you?
Well, I thought you were going to say, what's the future of stigma research look like in the
And
future?
please feel free,
HOP?
please feel free, yes, please feel free to add that in. Absolutely.
So I will freely admit I'm myopic because I have experience. This is there's actually a meta-analysis on hops. This has been studied in 8 randomized controlled trials that show it has pretty good effect. And more anecdotally, again, I've sort of lived the homophobia thing. I mean, when I was a kid, if you were a gay male, you didn't dare come out. And I sort of experienced the wonder of gay men, lesbians, and bisexual people coming out as having a big say. And so I sort of believe selective disclosure is a way to go. I sort of believe the more that are people are out, I think gay pride has so many effects, but one of the things that it hits those of us who are doubtful about homophobia right in the face about the realities that there is no difference. And so I'm kind of optimistic the more people come out with mental illness. And by the way, going back to your point, if we fixed it, a lot more people are out. I mean, one of the things, we have this amazing thing of peer providers now, people with lived experience who are out there providing services and their testimony to the issue of stigma. So I am optimistic about HOP, especially the more we develop it for different groups. I think the other thing, I'm somewhat interested in the structural stigma. Structural stigma is this whole thing of how stigma is more than just a bunch of bigotry. It's written into the laws. And so perhaps the heinous example in America, the Jim Crow laws, which were laws that discriminated against and kept Black people, quote unquote, in their places. So I think there's a desire to act to deal with structural stigma in mental illness. You might say there is none. 2 good examples. One is, despite we try to do all sorts of things with mental health parity, then the not the American Disability Act, the Affordable Care Act did some stuff in that area. people with mental illness still have reduced healthcare benefits. And the second thing is a sobering thing about how mental illness can be admitted into criminal decisions when they're irrelevant, or something your listeners might be interested in is family court. Is if somebody is trying to work with a spouse in family court about taking over their child, their previous mental health history can be introduced as a reason they not do it. I think those are two big areas.
And thank you for sharing those examples, especially the examples of how it impacts families, parents, and caregivers. Um, so again, I just want to sort of bring back to folks and highlight for folks, or point folks in the direction of our chat, because in the chat, as I said, Connor has been putting in links to some of these sites where you can get the materials and get information on HOP. I want to open it up now to Q&A. So please feel free to chat in your questions. I know some folks may have already been doing that during the course, so I'm going to kind of be taking a look at some of these. And while I do that, Pat, I did want to ask you a one issue that you just brought up is the oh, I had a note about this. Oh, sorry. It went away. It'll come back to me.
My
Give me a
mother would
moment.
have said it must have been a lie.
What? No.
My mother would have said it must have been a lie
Yeah.
that you couldn't remember. Never mind. Sorry.
No worries. Okay. So I'm going to. So one of our participants, Denise, says, I have personal experience with this as a child and now an adult. My teenage years were horrible and horrible for my parents. I'm so glad that we are coming out of the dark now. I'm no longer ashamed, and I'm very open about my mental health. But it took me so long to get there. I just got to the point through age and experience that I just didn't care what others thought anymore. I have had a lot of support along the way. I am so lucky to have incredible support. Actually, this raises a question. Actually, this is the question I was going to raise. When we're talking about adolescence in particular, and you touched on this earlier, with adolescents, um, I could imagine the struggle, the vulnerability it would take at an adolescent who's, oftentimes, right, the focus of adolescence is identity development. Um, and your thoughts about that? I've seen some folks who work with young people and adolescents in particular looking at this from the lens of identity development. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, Pat.
I'll go in two different ways. One is identity development is one of those technical terms that scares the hell out of me that I stay way far away. By that, I don't mean it's an illegitimate thing. I don't understand it. So I think identity development is a huge issue, and I encourage people to understand it better to do it. I do think adolescence, the support aspect of it, probably is really poignant. We were actually working with some people on adolescent programs for adolescents with burgeoning serious mental illness. And they really try to do power in the sense that these kids can decide whether they want to do it and how they want to do it. And they really try to foster some sort of support amongst them. So I think Denise's point about support, to me, the older I get, the more I think that's probably one of the major atomic bombs of atomic bomb. That's bad. One of the major ways of enhancing mental health is support.
And I will say, Denise added, I'm so glad that we're now coming out with resources for parents that is so needed. And she adds, my mother was so secretive, she refused to talk about it and would not let anyone in the immediate family talk about it. It created a huge rift between us, as I thought she was so ashamed of me that she did not want me. So and Denise, thank you for sharing, and that perspective of how it impacts families. And I know again, I know most of your work is with adults. How do you see that as different, the same, or distinct from what we see the impact of uh, adult children or parents of adults with serious mental illness, and your thoughts about that?
Well, again, as you say, that is where I work, and I do a comment from a more recovery rehabilitation viewpoint. And a lot of times we tend to focus for people with serious mental illness on the big stuff that we would say young adults shooting for, getting through school, getting a job, getting a career, finding a significant other, finding a place to live, dealing with health, not just mental health, physical health. And in the recovery world, self-determination has really become the big thing, probably one I hold on to too, which is we would say it's up to the person to decide what their goals are and how they're going to achieve them. Where does mom and dad fall and all that? I never want to say their problems are silly or irrelevant. That's just wrong. They just really need to separate what's their stigma and what are their decisions from their kids. So I've had people at NAMI come to me and say, why don't you develop HOP for my kids so they'll come out and tell their story? Well, that's not the purpose of a HOP. It's not for them to tell a story for you. It's for them to tell a story for themselves. I think there is a need for a HOP for parents of adult children on how to deal with their own sense of shame. And again, talk about dynamic. We would like to think that serious mental illness resolves itself and poof, it goes away, but it's an up and down sort of thing. So how do parents deal with that?
Hmm. Well, and actually, that brings in this again. I realize that the work still needs to occur, but kind of connecting this to something Denise raised. Joanne says, "How do I start a conversation with a parent whose child has a mental health diagnosis, but the parents refuse to accept?" I realize that's a lot, Pat. So that's a really tough question. But certainly, if you have thoughts about that.
Well, if I were a provider, I guess my response back is why. And I guess we come back to why should the parent do this? What's in it for them? How does it help them achieve their personal goals? Um, I think just to say, you need to look, you need to come out and talk about it, I'm just going to feel foreign to them. I think when you run into secrecy, secrecy is probably the poison of stigma. When you run into secrecy undermining any of your efforts in the therapy session with the kids, you might want to talk about coming out. That said, coming out is not a black or white issue. It's a very dynamic issue. They can decide along the way, they can back up. I think HOP would help them decide what the pros and cons are for it. That said, I think a lot of people just ain't going to get it. And so they may just not think it's for them.
Right. Um, and I can't say, Pat, just as someone who's worked with many parents, it's oftentimes getting into those questions around their experiences, what it's like for them, their understanding of the problems too, because I think oftentimes, obviously, and that's very culturally based, can be culturally based, their understanding of the problems or difficulties a young person may be having.
Somebody also just wrote about a family peer supporter. Amen. They can bring down the barriers quicker. And then you said about ethnicity. When they're from the same ethnic group, they can bridge that gap more quickly.
Yes, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. We definitely put out there a request, especially for family peer advocates and youth peer advocates, to join us today. A couple of things, actually, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to have folks complete a survey. And so, what I'd like to do is actually, Connor, if you could put the link to the survey in the chat. The reason for this is we wanted to gauge interest. So, full transparency, we've done a number of things already. As I said, I'd like to direct you to our special initiatives page where we've been developing resources around combating mental health stigma. We're going to have this, we've had this talk today with Pat. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have a panel discussion to go deeper on the issue of how do we combat mental health stigma and how do we address issues of mental health stigma among children, youth, families, parents, and caregivers. So we're going to have, there's more to come. But one of the things that we are interested in knowing is if there's interest. So in the survey, we're asking folks to tell us your interest in getting training on HOP. And actually, Pat, I do believe that if you want to share a little bit more about this, the training of HOP is in many ways receiving HOP. In other words, being a part of a group to begin with and then being able to sort of develop the skills to run a group. But Pat, if you want to say a little bit more about that. Well, actually, Pat, let's do this. Let's do this. Folks, if you can open up, we'd like you to open up that survey, bring it up for yourselves, and please take, we'll give you all a minute, and I'm just gonna be silent, Pat, if it's okay with you, because we know if we give you time now, and then you can answer that question on the other side. Okay, so let's take a quick minute, and I'm going to put it on the timer for folks to either start or complete that survey, and then we'll come back to Pat. Okay. So, actually, circling back around that, as I mentioned, Pat, just quickly, I briefly mentioned what the training would involve. If you want to say a little bit more about that for those who are interested.
So we have standardized training, which again, after COVID is mostly done virtually. We has it's a 3-day training. We train at 3 levels, similar to C1, do one, teach one. C1 is actually participate in it. So HOP is supposed to be done by people with lived experience. So the first day they do it. Second day, they learn platform skills so they can facilitate it. And the third day, they learn training skills so they become master trainers. You may be interested, again, HOP is kind of growing. There's the Academy of Peer Support, which is with New York, out of New Jersey, which just with us developed an entirely self-led training on HOP. We're not exactly sure its effect yet. We'd be glad for people to look at it and give us feedback. And we are also working, I think we talked to Jim with city and state departments of mental health about, we've trained some people in New York City on HOP on how to grow that, which we would love to get people this into discussion. Let me just, one more thing. The family part of it, the child part of it is really novel. And so the degree to which you want to engage in that would really be an opportunity.
Um, Fantastic. Any additional questions? I'm looking at some of the questions that have come through. And by the way, Connor, I don't know if you did it, but I did put a link in to the Academy of Peer Services in there if you want to go to there and look at their material. Um, and I think that brings us to the end of our webinar. Pat, any final thoughts you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I think the irony I learned is beating stigma goes back to the person with lived experience. And so the degree to which we support them either as peers or as allies is the way we'll tear this down.
Thank you, Pat. And I know there's at least a couple of other questions coming in about adapting or applying this. What we'd like to do is hear from you all as we think about moving forward and look at the interest. So we appreciate all of you who completed our survey to, again, give us a sense of the interest in training on HOP and supporting training on HOP for family peer advocates, youth peer advocates, or anyone working in peer services out there. So we look forward to getting that survey back and hearing, and we can follow up. We will be following up on this. As I said, I also wanted to mention really quick, and Connor, I don't know if you can pull up the slide, but just a heads up that in a couple of weeks, again, we're going to have a panel discussion focused much more narrowly on the discussion of, mental health stigma among children, youth. We're not going to be talking specifically about HOP, but we are going to be talking about mental health stigma among children, youth, parents, and caregivers and families. And for that panel, we're going to have a family peer advocate, a youth peer advocate, and two researchers doing work in this space who've taken the work of built on the shoulders of folks like Pat and others who've been doing this work for many years and sort of thinking a little bit more. So we look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, November 20th for that panel discussion, to have a deeper discussion again on the impact of mental health stigma on children, youth, families, parents, and caregivers. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want you all to join me in thanking Dr. Pat Corrigan for sharing his knowledge and wisdom on this topic today. And we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. And by the way, please feel free to visit ctacny.org for information about other offerings coming up in the near and or in the distant future as well. Take care, everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Take care, Pat.